Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Art of Adaptation. Today we're going to be talking about Avatar: The Last Airbender. Not the movie version. That version is a complete failure and I will certainly want to talk about it in the future, but for today we're going to annoy Shyamalan and talk about something other than him. Instead, I want to talk about the comics for The Last Airbender and its sequel series, The Legend of Korra. Specifically, how I kind of like the Korra comic more so far. Now admittedly, the Korra comic is only a chapter deep as I'm writing this, but how is that possible? The Last Airbender is one of my favorite shows of all time. A masterpiece of animation, character development, and world building. A show that combined hilarious jokes, heart-pounding action, poignant drama, and insightful philosophy. And The Legend of Korra wasn't that. Now, I am more than willing to admit my own views may be colored by my love of the original series, but I think it's the inferior show in almost every category. And yeah, I am harder on it than I probably should be, but I haven't met anyone who enjoys Legend of Korra over The Last Airbender. But when I started reading Turf Wars, the follow-up comic for Korra and Friends, I found myself more invested than when I read The Promise. So today I'm going to do a little compare and contrast to figure out why. Now, to be fair, I'm only going to compare Turf Wars to The Promise. I'm also going to try to keep my analysis to the first chapter of The Promise, since we only have the first chapter of Turf Wars at this moment. So with that out of the way, let's also annoy Guru Patik and break this into 4 parts. One of the first things that jumped out to me when I started to read Turf Wars was the change in art style. And at first, I didn't really care for it. But as I kept reading, I started to like it. It's funny because on a technical level, I think the art is a little worse in Turf Wars. Characters are sometimes off-model and there's a strange face on almost every page. But the art in The Promise never really worked for me. It feels flat. The outlines are too harsh, the colors are too vibrant, and the shadows are practically non-existent. Both of them are trying to incorporate parts of their art style from their respective show, while differentiating themselves just enough to feel like their own story. The lighting, though, is the biggest difference between the two comics. In most panels of Turf Wars, I can clearly tell where the light sources are. In The Promise, though, the lighting is less clear. Most of it is ambient lighting, and it makes everything feel just a little off. And this is sort of an inherited problem. Both shows have good animation, don't misunderstand me. But Avatar mostly took place during the day, and the nights seem to be closer to blue than black. It works well, especially seeing that the gang is rarely in a city at night, so the night coloration is reminiscent of starlight and moonlight. Darkness is only really black when they're underground. Legend of Korra, on the other hand, had way more scenes at night. And it was mostly urban nights. A lot of black with illumination coming from artificial sources, i.e. lots of harsh and distinct shadows. This was nicely complementary of the two shows' respective tones. Last Airbender was a lighthearted adventure but with actual stakes to keep the story interesting. Korra was much more intense from the start. The comics, though, are more similar than different. The central conflict for The Promise is whether Aang will have to kill his friend to save the world. The super bright colors and cartoony aesthetic really clash with that tone. Turf Wars is all about Korra dealing with the fallout from the ending of her series. And so far, that chiefly means her developing romance with Asami. The softer, more loosely defined art style feels far more complementary here. Now, like I said, The Last Airbender is a better series than Legend of Korra in almost every way, and that includes the story. But Last Airbender's better story kind of works against the comics. Let me explain. The Last Airbender told the story of Avatar Aang, who wakes up Captain America style after being frozen for 100 years. The world has suffered through 100 years of war and misery, and it's up to Aang to restore balance. We follow him and his friends through 3 seasons as he learns to master the elements and himself. Then, in the end, he succeeds, and all our characters reach an appropriate ending point. Only one thing is left unresolved. Because of the choice to delay the follow-up on Zuko's mom for the next comic series, a perfectly reasonable choice, honestly, it feels like there's nowhere to go. Only Zuko and Aang are given a dilemma with any meat to it. And it's 2 sides of the same dilemma. Sokka and Toph's subplot is kinda fun but doesn't amount to much and doesn't really tie in. It also feels of substantially lower stakes than the central conflict of the show. And if you do a follow-up series where the central conflict is not of greater stakes or demonstrably different, it's boring. On the other side, we have The Legend of Korra, the story of an avatar tasked with protecting and building on what Aang saved. She faces 4 separate threats and manages to help the world while finding balance within herself. Because the creators had no idea which season would be their last, they tried to make sure that all but the 3rd season had actual conclusions to them. Now that's a problem in the show, but that actually helps the comics. Another continuation doesn't feel that odd. It feels natural, and for me personally, it's welcome. Despite the goofy mech stuff, the 4th season is actually my favorite one. The show was usually of lower, more personal stakes as well. Our bad guys wanted to take over a city, release and merge with an evil spirit, kill Korra, and take over a fractured country. Meanwhile, back in The Last Airbender, the Fire Lord wanted to conquer the world and commit genocide. And these lower stakes can sometimes be a problem in the show. But that does mean when the comic opens with Korra having to figure out a peace between the spirits and the humans while navigating the waters of a new relationship, it feels natural. Yeah, you can roll your eyes, but I think it was pretty cool for Legend of Korra to end on a same-sex relationship. I think things like that are important. But let's put that to the side. Having a progressive message or positive representation is all well and good, but it doesn't necessarily make the work itself good. But thankfully, Turf Wars does actually take advantage of the possibility Korra and Asami's relationship provides. It lets us see sides to Korra we haven't really seen before. On top of that, neither Avatar series really had a good central romance. But this one is so far. Plus, the creators used this to build the world, by exploring queer rights and history in this specific world. Novelty is a tricky beast in a continuation of a story. We want it, but it needs to actually amount to something. And Turf Wars does this well. The Promise, on the other hand, has the central conflicts of the Earth Kingdom and the Fire Nation butting heads, Zuko being pulled between loyalty to his own nation and his own ethics, and Aang having to grow beyond the advice of his previous lives and adapt to changing times. All well and good, but all done in the original series. It's interesting and there's enough of a spin on things to not feel too stale, but it doesn't change the fact that those pieces of meat have already been chewed, and it weakens the comic as a result. This may seem a little odd, but it's actually really important to the quality of a comic. If page layout is good, you'll find yourself extra invested without really knowing why. But if it's bad, it can make a comic literally unreadable. Now, neither of these go to those extremes, but Turf Wars is better than The Promise. Overall, The Promise is a little too conventional for its own good and has some odd bits where the visual flow breaks down. Let's compare a few pages and dissect what's going on. To full screen mode. So let's start with this page. Our heroes are flying on their sky bison celebrating the end of the war. So let's start at the top left, where you naturally start reading a page unless it's a manga, and then you'd start at the top right. Our eyes are immediately drawn down by this long panel on the side. Everything in this panel, from the motion lines, to the posture of the people in the saddle, to Momo hanging off of Aang, to the negative space at the bottom of the page, to the two literal arrows, draw our eyes to the bottom of the page. But then we have to immediately snap our attention back to the top right, and all sense of momentum and energy this image built up was just gone. In the top panel, it's unclear whether or not they're still diving. Then we progressively zoom out for 2 panels. This flow is so strange, and for no real reason. And all the negative space between the panels makes everything feel disjointed and awkward. Or how about this one? Zuko is awoken in the middle of the night. He panics, thinking it's an assassination attempt, apparently the 6th one he's had. But what about this page layout communicates fear or anger or frazzled nerves? Is it the muted colors, the calming blues, the fact that all the panels are similarly sized rectangles, the vertical symmetry of the layout? The only 2 elements that convey the mood of the scene are in the last panel. The fact that Zuko is attacking an empty hallway, clearly a desperate attack one would make in this situation, and the fact that Zuko's arm and head go a little outside the frame. A useful technique for conveying extreme size or erratic movement. Now, not all the pages are as poorly laid out as these 2, but this is a problem in The Promise. It feels like the comic is trying to emulate the storyboards from the show. Heck, I think with some work these could be animated into some killer scenes. But storyboards are not and are never intended to be a finished product. Turf Wars, on the other hand, let's go back to full screen mode. Here we have Korra and Asami going on a vacation in the spirit world. Let's start at the top right again. We start with a bit of blank space, so our eyes move down to find Asami moving towards Korra, which helps pull the eye down to the midpoint of the page. Below that, we have nothing of interest in this panel, so we move on to the next one. At the same level, we have Asami again being guided down by Korra, which pulls the eyes down further. Then we have these spirit fish that help draw our eye further still until we're once again at level with our characters, now at the bottom of the page, sitting together and watching a waterfall. For bonus points, the weird ribbon-like waterfall pulls our eyes back up into position to read the next page. Plus, we see our two young lovers literally getting closer to each other, taking advantage of the easy visual metaphor of spatial distance. Overall, a pretty good page. There's also this one. There's no flow on this one, but this time it's intentional. In this scene, Korra is visiting a refugee camp, seeing what she needs to do to help, but quickly becomes overwhelmed. So we put Korra in the center of the page, surrounded by these irregularly shaped panels of people asking for help. The lack of flow gives the feeling that they're all happening at once. And just look at how wonderfully janky these panels are. None of them are the same shape. In fact, each of them are composed of a unique set of angles and side lengths, really helping to sell the chaos of the moment. Plus, there's very little negative space in any of these panels, really selling the feeling of claustrophobia you get from being stuck in the middle of a large crowd and the pressure Korra is under. I'll admit this wasn't a super fair comparison. I did take the two worst pages of The Promise and put them up against the two best pages of Turf Wars. And like I said, neither of these comics go to the extreme ends of the page layout quality scale. But overall, Turf Wars seems to have a better understanding of sequential art and is more willing to separate itself from the animation style of its original show. The Promise was trying to more closely recreate the animation of Last Airbender in panel form, and ultimately it proved a detriment to the overall quality. Now, a full comparison between these two is currently impossible. The Promise is done, but Turf Wars isn't. But I'm cautiously optimistic that the Korra comics are going to take advantage of the momentum built at the end of Legend of Korra. But I guess only time will tell. See you guys next time.